My husband sees me with another man in a bistro. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when everything began to unravel. The kind of day where the air smells like cinnamon and the leaves crunch underfoot like nature's own soundtrack. I was sitting in our favorite bistro, the rustic table, sipping on a caramel latte and scrolling through my phone. My husband, Mark, was supposed to meet me here after his meeting, but he was running late. Typical Mark, always losing track of time when he's deep in work mode. I didn't notice him at first, the man sitting across the bistro, his eyes locked on me. He looked familiar, too familiar. His dark hair, the way he tilted his head when he smiled, even the way he drummed his fingers on the table. It was like looking into a mirror, but a male version. My heart skipped a beat. Asterisk, no, it can't be. Emily called out, his voice hesitant but warm. I froze. That voice. It was deeper than I remembered, but it carried the same cadence, the same lilt. My twin brother, Alex, the brother I hadn't seen in over a decade, the brother I thought I'd never see again. Alex, I whispered, my voice trembling. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and walked over to me. My mind was racing. Why now? And most importantly, how was I going to explain this to Mark? Before I could say anything, the bistro door swung open, and there he was, my husband. His tie was slightly askew, and he had that harried look he always gets when he's rushing. His eyes scanned the room, landing on me and then on Alex. His expression shifted from relief to confusion, then to something darker, suspicion. Emily, Mark said, his voice tight. Who's this? I could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. Alex looked at Mark, then back at me, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. Asterisk, you haven't told him. His expression seemed to say. I swallowed hard, my mind racing for an explanation. Mark, this is I stammered, my voice faltering. This is Alex. He's my brother. Mark blinked, his confusion deepening. Your brother? Since when do you have a brother? You never mentioned a brother. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken accusation. Asterisk, why didn't you tell me? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It's complicated, I said finally. Alex and I were separated when we were kids. I haven't seen him in years. Mark's eyes narrowed, and I could see the gears turning in his head. He wasn't buying it. Not entirely. Separated how? He asked, his tone sharp. Alex stepped in, his voice calm but firm. Our parents split up when we were young, he explained. Emily stayed with our mum, and I went with our dad. We lost touch over the years. I've been trying to find her for a long time. Mark crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. And you just happened to find her here today. Alex shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. Call it fate, he said, or maybe just really good timing. I could see the skepticism in Mark's eyes, but he didn't push it. Not yet. Instead, he turned to me, his voice softer but still tinged with hurt. Why didn't you tell me about it? I thought we told each other everything. I felt a lump form in my throat. I wanted to, I said quietly, but it's a painful part of my past. I didn't know how to bring it up. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. Well, you've brought it up now, he said, his tone resigned. So, what happens next? We decided to continue the conversation over dinner. It seemed like the logical next step, but in hindsight it was a terrible idea. The tension between Mark and Alex was palpable, and I felt like I was walking on eggshells the entire time. We went to a small Italian restaurant down the street, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. It was cozy, but the atmosphere was anything but. Mark sat across from me, his arms crossed, while Alex sat beside me, his posture relaxed but his eyes wary. The waiter came by to take our orders, and I could barely focus on the menu. My mind was spinning, trying to figure out how to navigate this minefield. Mark ordered a steak, rare, while Alex went for the lasagna. I opted for a salad, though I doubted I'd be able to eat much. As we waited for our food, the conversation turned to small talk, or at least an attempt at it. Alex asked Mark about his job, and Mark answered curtly, his tone clipped. I could tell he was still upset, and I didn't blame him, but I also didn't know how to fix it. So, Alex, Mark said, his voice dripping with faux casualness. What do you do for a living? Alex smiled, seemingly unfazed by Mark's tone. I'm a photographer, he said. I travel a lot, capturing moments from around the world. Sounds interesting, Mark replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. And you just happened to be in town today. Alex's smile didn't waver. Actually, I've been in town for a few weeks, he said. I've been working on a project here. When I saw Emily at the bistro, I couldn't believe it. It's been so long. Mark's eyes flicked to me, and I could see the question in them. Asterisk, why didn't you tell me he was in town? I looked down at my hands, feeling a pang of guilt. I hadn't even known Alex was here. How could I have told Mark? The food arrived, and we ate in silence for a while. The clinking of silverware against plates was the only sound at our table. It was awkward, to say the least. Finally, Mark broke the silence. So, Emily, he said, his voice tight, when were you planning on telling me about Alex? Or were you just going to keep him a secret forever? I flinched at his words, the accusation cutting deep. I wasn't keeping him a secret, I said, my voice trembling. I I didn't know how to bring it up. It's not exactly an easy topic. Mark's eyes narrowed. And yet, here we are, he said, talking about it. So, what else haven't you told me? I felt a surge of anger, mixed with guilt. Mark, that's not fair, I said, my voice rising. You're acting like I've been lying to you, but I haven't. This is just, it's complicated. Alex cleared his throat, interrupting us. Look, I don't want to cause any trouble, he said, his voice calm but firm. I just wanted to reconnect with my sister. If that's a problem, I can leave. Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he pushed his plate away and stood up. I need some air, he said, his voice low. I'll be outside. He walked out of the restaurant, leaving Alex and me alone at the table. I felt a lump form in my throat, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice breaking. This isn't how I wanted this to go. Alex reached over and placed a hand on mine. It's okay, Em, he said softly. He's just processing. Give him time. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the storm. Mark was waiting outside the restaurant, his arms crossed and his expression stormy. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation ahead. Alex stayed inside, giving us some space, but I could feel his presence like a shadow looming over us. Mark, I began, my voice tentative. I'm sorry, I should have told you about Alex. I didn't know how. Mark turned to me, his eyes blazing. You didn't know how, he repeated, his voice rising. Emily, we've been married for 5 years. 5 years, and you never thought to mention that you have a twin brother. What else haven't you told me? I felt a surge of frustration, mixed with guilt. Mark, it's not like that, I said, my voice pleading. Alex and I were separated when we were kids. It's a painful part of my past, and I didn't want to drag it up. I didn't think it would ever come up. Mark shook his head, his expression incredulous. But it did come up, Emily, he said, and now I'm left feeling like I don't even know you. How could you keep something like this from me? I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I blinked them back. I didn't mean to hurt you, I said, my voice breaking. I didn't know how to talk about it. It's not something I like to think about. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. Emily, I get that it's hard, he said, his tone softening slightly. But we're supposed to be a team. We're supposed to share everything, even the hard stuff. How can I trust you if you're keeping secrets from me? I felt a pang of guilt, his words hitting home. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I didn't mean to keep it from you. I didn't know how to bring it up. Mark looked at me, his expression conflicted. I need some time to process this, he said finally. I'm going to stay at my brother's place tonight. We'll talk tomorrow. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. Okay, I said quietly. I love you, Mark. He didn't respond, just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, feeling more alone than ever. I went back inside the restaurant, where Alex was waiting. He looked up as I approached, his expression concerned. Is everything okay? He asked. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. No, I said, my voice breaking. Mark's upset. He's staying at his brother's place tonight. Alex stood up, pulling me into a hug. I'm sorry, Em, he said softly. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I shook my head, burying my face in his shoulder. It's not your fault, I said. I should have told him about you. I didn't know how. Alex pulled back, looking at me with a small smile. Well, you've told him now, he said, and he'll come around. He just needs time. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed it. I hope so, I said quietly. We left the restaurant and walked back to my apartment, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. It was strange, being with Alex after so many years. He felt familiar, yet different, like a piece of my past that had suddenly come back to life. When we got to the apartment, I made us some tea, and we sat on the couch, talking late into the night. Alex told me about his life, his travels, and his work as a photographer. I told him about Mark, our marriage, and the life we'd built together. It was cathartic, in a way, to finally share my life with him. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Mark's words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the rift that had formed between us. I didn't know how to fix it, or if it could even be fixed. All I knew was that I had to try. But the next morning, I woke up to an empty apartment. Alex had left early, saying he had some work to do, but he promised to call later. I felt a pang of loneliness as I looked around the quiet space, the events of the previous day weighing heavily on my mind. I tried calling Mark, but he didn't answer. I left a voicemail, my voice trembling as I apologized again and asked him to come home. Then I sat on the couch staring at my phone, willing it to ring. It didn't. Hours passed, and I felt like I was going out of my mind. I needed to do something, anything, to distract myself. So I decided to clean the apartment, scrubbing every surface until it sparkled. It didn't help much, but it gave me something to focus on. Finally, around noon, the doorbell rang. My heart leaped into my throat as I rushed to answer it, hoping it was Mark. But it wasn't. It was Alex. Hey, he said, holding up a bag of groceries. I thought you might need some company. I felt a surge of gratitude as I let him in. Thanks, I said, my voice cracking. I could use some. We spent the afternoon cooking together, making a big pot of soup and baking some bread. It was comforting, in a way, to have someone there with me. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. Finally, around dinner time, the door opened, and Mark walked in. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed, and his expression guarded. I felt my heart skip a beat as I stood up, my hands trembling. "Mark," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're home." He nodded, his eyes flicking to Alex, who was standing in the kitchen. "Yeah," he said, his voice tight. "We need to talk." The tension in the room was palpable as Mark and I sat down at the kitchen table. Alex stayed in the living room, giving us some space, but I could feel his presence like a shadow, looming over us. "Mark," I began, my voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you about Alex. I didn't know how." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Emily, I get that it's hard," he said, his tone softer than it had been the night before. "But we're supposed to be a team. We're supposed to share everything, even the hard stuff. How can I trust you if you're keeping secrets from me?" I felt a pang of guilt, his words hitting home. "I didn't mean to keep it from you," I said, my voice breaking. I didn't know how to bring it up. It's not something I like to think about." Mark looked at me, his expression conflicted. "I get that," he said finally. "But you have to understand how this looks, Emily. I come home, and there's a man who looks just like you, and you're telling me he's your long-lost twin brother. It's a lot to process." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I know," I said, "and I'm sorry. I should have told you. I didn't want to drag up the past." Mark reached over and took my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Emily, I love you," he said, his voice soft. "But we can't have secrets between us. Not if we want this marriage to work." I felt a surge of relief mixed with guilt. "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "And I'm sorry. I'll do better, Mark. I promise." He nodded, his expression softening. "Okay," he said. "We'll work through this together." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his embrace. But as I looked over at Alex, who was still standing in the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the storm. The days that followed were complicated. Mark and I were trying to rebuild the trust that had been broken. But it wasn't easy. Every time I looked at him, I could see the hurt in his eyes, and it killed me. I wanted to make it right, but I didn't know how. Alex, meanwhile, had become a constant presence in our lives. He was staying in a nearby hotel, but he spent most of his time at our apartment, helping me cook, clean, and just be there. It was strange, having him around after so many years, but it was also comforting. He was a piece of my past that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. But as the days turned into weeks, the tension between Mark and Alex began to grow. They were civil to each other, but there was an undercurrent of animosity that I couldn't ignore. Mark was still wary of Alex, and Alex was just being Alex. He had a way of getting under people's skin without even trying. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Mark pulled me aside. "Emily, we need to talk," he said, his voice low. I felt a pang of anxiety as I followed him into the bedroom. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's Alex," he said. "I know he's your brother, but he's always here. It's like we don't have any privacy anymore." I felt a surge of guilt mixed with frustration. "Mark, he's my brother," I said. "He's been gone for so long, and I want to spend time with him." Mark's jaw tightened. "I get that," he said, "but we need time for us to—" "I feel like I'm losing you, Emily." I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I reached out to him. "You're not losing me, Mark," I said, my voice breaking. "I love you. I need to figure this out." Mark sighed, pulling me into a hug. "I love you too, Emily," he said, "but we need to find a balance. We can't let Alex come between us." I nodded, burying my face in his shoulder. "I know," I said. "I'll talk to him." The next day I sat down with Alex and tried to explain how Mark was feeling. It wasn't easy. Alex had always been stubborn, and he didn't take criticism well. "So, what?" he said, his tone defensive. "I'm just supposed to disappear?" After all these years, I shook my head, feeling a pang of guilt. "No, Alex," I said. We need some space. Mark and I need time to work through this." Alex's expression softened, and he reached over to take my hand. "I get it, Em," he said. "I don't want to come between you two. I missed you. I missed us." I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I squeezed his hand. "I missed you too," I said. "But we need to find a balance. We can't let this tear us apart." Alex nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Okay," he said. "I'll back off. But I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me." I smiled, feeling a surge of affection for him. "I wouldn't have it any other way," I said. In the weeks that followed, things began to settle down. Alex still came around, but he gave us more space, and Mark and I started to rebuild the trust that had been broken. It wasn't easy, but we were making progress. One evening, as we sat on the couch together, Mark turned to me, his expression serious. "Emily, I've been thinking," he said, "about Alex." I felt a pang of anxiety as I looked at him. "What about him?" I asked. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know I've been difficult," he said, "but I think I understand now. He's your brother, and he's important to you." I don't want to come between that. I felt a surge of relief as I reached out to take his hand. Thank you, Mark, I said, my voice trembling. That means a lot to me. Mark nodded, his expression softening. I love you, Emily, he said, and I want us to be a team, but that means we have to be honest with each other, even when it's hard. I nodded, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. I know, I said, and I'll do better. Mark, I promise. He pulled me into a hug, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. We still had a long way to go, but we were moving in the right direction. And as I looked over at Alex, who was sitting in the kitchen, I felt a surge of gratitude. He was my brother, my twin, and he was back in my life. And no matter what, we were going to make this work. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new normal. Mark and I were stronger than ever, and Alex had become a permanent fixture in our lives. He was still stubborn and infuriating at times, but he was also kind, loyal, and fiercely protective of me. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mark turned to me, his expression thoughtful. Emily, I've been thinking, he said, about the future. I felt a pang of anxiety as I looked at him. What about it? I asked. Mark smiled, taking my hand. I think we should start a family, he said. I want to have kids with you, Emily. I want to build a life together. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I squeezed his hand. I want that too, Mark, I said, more than anything. He pulled me into a hug, and I felt a surge of happiness. We still had challenges ahead, but we were facing them together. And as I looked over at Alex, who was sitting on the steps, I felt a surge of gratitude. He was my brother, my twin, and he was back in my life. And no matter what, we were going to make this work. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more interesting stories happening around you.